Christmas Eve, 1945. Fayetteville, West Virginia. A quiet home filled with laughter, decorations, and the scent of pine. But by morning, that same house would be reduced to smoldering ashes, and 5 Sodder children would be gone, without a single trace. The police said it was an accident. The fire department called it a tragedy. But the evidence whispered something darker: sabotage, corruption, maybe even murder. I'm your host, and tonight, we dive into one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. The disappearance of the Sodder children. The fire that wouldn't burn the truth. For decades, their parents fought against silence, lies, and fear, posting billboards, hiring detectives, and begging for answers that never came. This case isn't just about 5 missing children. It's about how far love can go when justice refuses to listen. What if the fire wasn't an accident? What if someone wanted the Sodder family destroyed and made sure no one would ever find out why? Stay with us as we retrace the night of the fire, the twisted investigation, and the theories that still divide experts today. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to this channel, tap the notification bell, and give this video a like, because every week we uncover new truths buried beneath decades of deception. Comment your thoughts as we go. Could this have been arson, a kidnapping, or something more sinister? This is the vanished truth. And you're watching #DarkTruth25, where real stories burn brighter than fiction. Let's begin. The night the fire began. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, a quiet coal mining community where families gathered around fireplaces and trees glittered in the windows. For the Sodder family, the night had started like any other holiday. George and Jenny Sodder lived in a 2-story wooden home with their 10 children. They were well known in town, hardworking, close-knit, and deeply protective of one another. That night, the older children had stayed up late, laughing and opening small presents, while their parents and younger siblings drifted off to bed. But by 1 a.m., joy turned to terror. Jenny Sodder woke suddenly to the smell of smoke, thick, choking, and coming from the attic area, where some of the children slept. She screamed for her husband, George, as flames began licking through the hallway. They rushed to gather the children and escape into the cold night air. Outside, chaos reigned. The fire spread faster than anyone could understand, a roaring inferno devouring the wooden house in minutes. George and Jenny, standing barefoot in the snow, realized only 4 of their 10 children were with them. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the youngest 5, were still inside. George tried desperately to go back. He smashed a window, slicing his arm. He ran toward his truck to pull it closer, but the engine wouldn't start. He dashed to the rain barrel for water, but it was frozen solid. Desperation turned to disbelief as he realized he could do nothing but watch. The family screamed their children's names into the flames as the roof collapsed. Within 45 minutes, the house was reduced to blackened ash. By dawn, the Fayetteville Fire Department finally arrived, not with sirens and speed, but hours later, long after the flames had burned out. They searched the ashes for the remains of the missing children, but there were none. No bones, no bodies, nothing but faint traces of burnt wood and melted appliances. Officials suggested the fire was caused by faulty wiring, but George disagreed. The house's wiring had recently been inspected, and no remains? Even in intense fires, bones do not completely vanish. Something didn't make sense. Neighbors began whispering. Why had the phone line been cut that night? Why did a stranger appear at their home days earlier, warning George that his house would go up in smoke? And why, just before the fire, had one of the Sodder boys seen a strange car parked along the highway, watching their home? As the smoke cleared and the ashes cooled, the Sodder family began to realize they weren't only facing a tragedy, they were facing a mystery. Because if the children had perished in the fire, were their remains? And if they hadn't, where had they gone? The fire was only the beginning. What followed was a decades-long search for truth, one filled with strange clues, mysterious sightings, and questions that no one could ever fully answer. The morning after the fire, The Sodder family stood before the smoldering ruins of their home, numb with disbelief. Smoke still rose from the ashes as the December wind cut through the charred remains of what had once been filled with laughter and warmth. Neighbors gathered silently. The tragedy had struck deep, 5 young children gone on Christmas morning. But even among the grief, something felt wrong. Jenny Sodder couldn't accept what she saw, or rather, what she didn't see. No bones, no teeth, no trace of her children in the ashes. She had read that in other fires, even intense ones, the skeletal remains of victims were always found. Sometimes small fragments, sometimes nearly whole. But here nothing. The ash was sifted, searched, and combed through, but no remains were ever recovered. When the Fayetteville fire chief, F.J. Morris, arrived, he reportedly told the family that the fire must have been so hot it cremated the bodies completely. But Jenny knew that couldn't be true. She later conducted her own experiments, burning animal bones in her stove for hours, and even after intense heat, fragments always remained. So where were the remains of her children? Even more troubling were the strange inconsistencies that began to surface almost immediately. The phone line had been cut. Investigators discovered that the Sodders' telephone line wasn't burned through. It had been deliberately sliced. Someone had severed it before or during the fire, cutting off any chance for the family to call for help. The ladder was missing. The family always kept a ladder propped against the side of the house, easily accessible in case of emergencies. That night, when George ran to get it, it was gone. Days later, a neighbor found it tossed down an embankment nearby, far from where it should have been. The trucks wouldn't start. George's 2 coal delivery trucks, in perfect working order just a day before, suddenly refused to start during the fire. Later, mechanics found nothing wrong with them. And then came the reports, sightings, sounds, and suspicions that would push the mystery deeper. A telephone operator confirmed that someone had called the Sodder home around midnight, asking for a wrong number. When Jenny hung up, she noticed all the lights were still on and the doors unlocked. Odd, since she thought the children had gone to bed. A few neighbors recalled seeing a man watching the house the day before the fire, sitting in a parked car along the road. Another witness said they saw bright lights moving toward the mountains around the same time the fire broke out, as if something was being carried away or dropped from the sky. It was just an unfortunate accident. But to George and Jenny, this was the beginning of something far more sinister, a web of clues and contradictions that no official explanation could untangle. They weren't ready to let go, not without answers, not without proof. Over the next weeks, the Sodders began to gather evidence on their own, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and writing letters to anyone who would listen. They weren't just grieving parents anymore. They were detectives in their own tragedy. If this was just a fire, then why were so many things deliberately placed in motion to silence the Sodders that night? The deeper they searched, the more the line between accident and conspiracy began to blur. Weeks passed after the Christmas Eve fire, but George and Jenny Sodder refused to let their grief turn into silence. Something inside them whispered that the truth was still out there, buried beneath confusion, mistakes, and perhaps deception. What began as a tragedy was slowly transforming into one of America's strangest unsolved mysteries. The missing remains and the quick closure. The local coroner's jury quickly ruled the fire an accident, citing faulty electrical wiring. But George and Jenny found that impossible to accept. Just before Christmas, the house's wiring had been inspected and declared safe. Even more suspicious, in the days leading up to the fire, the Christmas lights had stayed on during the blaze, meaning the electricity was still running. Faulty wiring couldn't explain that. And then there was the speed of the investigation. Within days, the case was closed, the ashes buried, and the lot filled with dirt. No serious forensic testing. No crime scene photographs. It was as if the tragedy had been rushed into history before anyone could start asking the right questions. But George and Jenny were asking those questions. Mysterious strangers and warnings. Just days before the fire, a strange man had appeared at the Sodder home, asking about work. As he walked around the house, he pointed to the 2 fuse boxes and said, "This place is going to go up in smoke someday." George was puzzled by the comment, but thought little of it at the time. Then another visitor, a life insurance salesman, arrived. When George declined to buy, the salesman grew angry, reportedly shouting, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed. You'll pay for what you said about Mussolini." That threat hit hard. George, an Italian immigrant, had been outspoken in his criticism of Benito Mussolini, which angered some members of the tight-knit Italian-American community in Fayetteville. Could this have been more than just words? Could politics and vengeance have somehow intertwined with this tragedy? Strange sightings begin. In the weeks after the fire, witnesses began to report sightings of the missing Sodder children. A woman working at a Charleston motel claimed she saw 5 children matching their description, accompanied by 2 unfamiliar adults. The group checked in late at night and spoke in what sounded like Italian. Another witness, a waitress, recalled serving them breakfast and noticing how nervous the children appeared, as if afraid to speak. There were also letters sent to the family, and signed notes saying the children were alive and being cared for by distant relatives or taken overseas. Each clue pulled George and Jenny further from closure and deeper into obsession. The billboard and the private investigation. In 1949, the Sodders decided they would no longer rely on local police. They hired C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator, and began spreading word of the mystery themselves. George erected a large billboard near the site of their former home, a haunting black and white sign showing the faces of the 5 missing children and the words, "5 children missing after fire December 24th, 1945. What was their fate?" For decades, that billboard stood as a symbol of both hope and defiance. It became one of the most recognized images in West Virginia, reminding everyone who passed that something terrible and unexplained had happened here. A box of bones and another dead end. When the site was excavated again years later, a few bone fragments were found, but testing showed they belonged to a young adult male, not child. Another lead, another dead end. Each discovery only raised more questions. Who was that man? How did his bones end up in the Sodders' property? And if he wasn't one of the children, where were they? The mystery was growing, not shrinking. It was no longer a simple house fire. It was a riddle that touched on crime, conspiracy, and the impossible. Every clue the Sodders found seemed to lead to another shadow. Were they chasing ghosts? Or had someone truly stolen their children from the flames? By now, the story of the Sodder children had become more than a family tragedy. It was an American enigma. Newspapers, radio hosts, and small-town gossip all circled the same impossible question. If the children didn't die in the fire, where did they go? An endless search begins. For George and Jenny Sodder, there was never a moment of rest. Every spare dollar, every sleepless night, and every ounce of faith went into searching for their missing children. George traveled across states, following rumors, letters, and tips from strangers who swore they had seen the children. From Florida to New York, from Canada to Kentucky, each new clue seemed promising, until it wasn't. He carried photographs of his 5 lost children in his pocket and would often approach strangers who resembled them, asking softly, "Have you seen these faces before?" It became a lifelong mission and a heavy curse. A woman on a train. One of the most chilling stories came from a woman who claimed she saw the missing Sodder children the morning after the fire, peering out a car window as it passed through Fayetteville. She said she recognized their faces from a newspaper and remembered something odd. They didn't look scared, just confused. Who were the adults in that car? No one ever found out. The mafia theory. Then came one of the most disturbing theories, that organized crime may have played a role. George's outspoken political views, especially his anti-Mussolini stance, had angered certain Italian-American circles during World War II. Rumors whispered that the Sodder children might have been taken by individuals connected to the Italian mafia, perhaps as revenge or warning to silence George. This theory seemed far-fetched, but certain details made people wonder. Why were no bodies ever found, despite the fire supposedly burning the entire house? Why did witnesses see a man stealing a block-and-tackle truck near the scene that night, possibly the same one used to cut the Sodders phone line before the fire began? Coincidence? Or careful planning? The ladder, the truck, and the cut phone line. In every unsolved mystery, small details hold the biggest weight. The ladder that the family always kept by the side of the house was missing the morning after the fire, later found thrown down an embankment. Two of George's trucks, which had worked perfectly the day before, refused to start that night, almost as if they'd been sabotaged. And the phone line to the Sodder house? It wasn't destroyed by the flames. It had been cut deliberately. Jenny's nightmares and the strange letter. Years later, Jenny began to have recurring dreams, vivid, haunting visions of her children calling out to her from far away. But then came something real, a letter, postmarked Kentucky, 1967. Inside was a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, one of the missing boys. On the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illo boys, a 90132, or 90,135. The Sodders sent the photo to the authorities, but no one could trace the address or the meaning behind the code. Was it a cruel prank, or a message from someone who knew the truth? George and Jenny eventually enlarged the image and hung it above their fireplace, hoping that one day, someone would recognize the face and bring them the answers they've been waiting decades for. A lifetime of searching. As the years went by, George's health declined. He continued the search until his final days, driving across the country, knocking on doors, and chasing every whisper. Jenny, dressed in black for the rest of her life, kept the lights burning in her home every night, just in case her children found their way back. The Sodder case had now spanned generations, and still, no resolution was in sight. Suggested closing narration for Chapter 4. Each clue brought more confusion. Each hope ended in heartbreak. But the Sodders refused to let time bury the truth. What happened to their 5 missing children, and why did so many seem determined to hide it? Nearly 80 years have passed since that Christmas Eve in 1945, but the story of the Sodder children still refuses to fade into history. It lingers in family photo albums, in whispers across Fayetteville, and in the unanswered pages of America's most haunting mysteries. The billboard that wouldn't let the town forget. In the early 1950s, George and Jenny Sodder took one final, desperate step to keep their children's story alive. Along Route 16, near their home in Fayetteville, they built a massive billboard. It showed the faces of their 5 missing children with bold letters reading. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Still alive? Beneath, a $10,000 reward was offered for any information leading to their discovery. Drivers from across West Virginia and beyond stopped to stare. Some took pictures, others whispered theories, but no one could give answers. For nearly 40 years, that billboard stood as both a memorial and a challenge, a haunting symbol of parental love refusing to die, theories that refused to rest. To this day, experts and online sleuths continue to debate what truly happened that night. Let's revisit the leading theories, each as unsettling as the last. 1. Accidental fire theory. The official ruling declared the fire accidental, likely caused by faulty wiring. But the evidence doesn't fit. The phone line was cut. The ladder moved. The truck sabotaged. Even modern fire experts agree that a blaze hot enough to incinerate 5 bodies, yet leave the basement items intact, is virtually impossible. So, if not an accident, what was it? 2. Kidnapping and cover-up. Some believe the Sodder children were kidnapped and the fire staged as a distraction. Witnesses claim to have seen them alive. A woman at a Charleston hotel, a waitress in a nearby town, a neighbor who said a car sped away from the area just as the fire began. If true, this means multiple people would have had to be involved in the abduction, arson, and subsequent cover-up. A horrifying thought for a small West Virginia town. 3. Mafia retaliation theory. As discussed earlier, George Sodder's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini and the Italian regime may have angered powerful groups. Some speculate the fire was meant as a warning, and the children were taken alive as leverage. If so, why were they never returned? Why were they never found, even after decades of searching? 4. supernatural or paranormal theories. Over time, the case took on an almost supernatural air. Locals claimed the fire was cursed. Others believed the children were victims of some bizarre experiment or secret operation. Online, some still whisper that the strange light seen over the mountains that night could have been UFO activity, connecting the Sodder case to early post-war abduction myths. Far-fetched? Maybe. But every logical explanation has failed, and mystery has filled the silence. The family's final years. George died in 1969, his heart broken, still searching. Jenny followed in 1989, after decades of keeping the lights burning in the window, a silent signal to her missing children. After her passing, the billboard was finally taken down. All that remains today is a small plaque at the site, quietly honoring the lost. But even death could not end the search. The surviving Sodder children, and later their descendants, carried the investigation into the modern era. DNA testing, forensic review, and renewed appeals for tips. Yet still, nothing definitive has ever surfaced. Legacy of a mystery that wouldn't die. The Sodder story endures because it touches something deeply human, the unbreakable bond between parents and their children and the torment of not knowing. How do you bury someone when you don't know if they're dead? How do you stop searching when there's even a 1% chance they're alive? That pain became the Sodder's legacy, a flame that refused to go out, long after the fire turned to ash. The disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Was it a tragic accident, a criminal act, or something beyond our understanding? The answers lie somewhere between memory, myth, and the silence of time. But one thing is certain. Until truth is found, the story will keep burning in the shadows of West Virginia. If this story gripped you the way it did us, hit that like button, subscribe to Dark Truth 25, and share this documentary to keep the memory of the Sodder children alive. We uncover new real-life mysteries every week, stories that deserve to be heard. Stay curious, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next investigation. As the weeks turned into months after the fire, Fayetteville, once a quiet mining town nestled in the mountains of West Virginia, began to change. What was once a community united by tragedy soon grew divided by fear and silence. People stopped talking about the fire. Neighbors who once stood beside the Sodders during the investigation began to look away when George passed by. Even friends who had offered help in the early days now avoided the topic altogether. Why? George believed he knew the reason: fear. The political shadow over the Sodders. In the 1940s, Fayetteville was home to a large Italian-American population. George, an immigrant from Sardinia, had built a good life there. But he was outspoken, fiercely independent, and unafraid to voice his opinions. He had spoken out publicly against Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had supporters even among some local business owners. And just months before the fire, a traveling insurance salesman came to George's home. When George refused to buy insurance, the man reportedly grew angry and shouted, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll be paid for the dirty remarks you've made about Mussolini." At the time, George dismissed it as empty talk. But after the fire, those words haunted him. The fire marshal and the vanishing evidence. Even more puzzling was the handling of the investigation. The local fire chief, F.J. Morris, told the Sodders that the fire had been too hot to leave remains, an idea fire experts later called absurd. Then came another strange detail. Morris claimed he found a heart among the ashes and buried it in a metal box near the site. But when the box was later dug up, it contained nothing but fresh beef liver, untouched by flame. Why would a fire chief fake evidence of a human organ? Was it a bizarre attempt to comfort the family, or something more suspicious? The investigators who looked away. When the Sodders demanded a deeper investigation, state officials refused. The coroner's jury ruled the cause accidental, and the case was closed within weeks. Even after new evidence surfaced, no one reopened it. Letters, appeals, and legal petitions sent by the Sodders went unanswered. George later said it felt like the entire system had turned its back on them. And maybe it had. Some theorists believe that powerful local figures, possibly connected to the salesman or to organized crime networks in nearby towns, pressured authorities to suppress further investigation. To this day, no one has been able to prove or disprove that theory. The Silent Town. By the 1950s, the Sodders were seen as obsessed. Locals whispered that George and Ginny couldn't accept reality. Children who grew up near Fayetteville were told not to mention the case, or even to drive near the remains of the house. The silence became a second grave. But George and Ginny refused to stay quiet. If no one would help them, they would tell the story themselves through flyers, letters, and eventually that massive billboard that would make their family famous across America. For some in Fayetteville, the fire was a tragedy best forgotten. But for the Sodders, forgetting meant betrayal. As the town tried to move on, the family dug deeper into secrets, corruption, and perhaps something far more sinister than a fire on Christmas Eve. As George and Ginny's search deepened, one theory began to overshadow all the others. That the fire at the Sodder home wasn't an accident at all, but a warning, a message. And the people behind it were far more dangerous than anyone dared to imagine. An unwanted enemy. Before the fire, George Sodder had been known across Fayetteville as a hard-working, self-made man. He ran a successful trucking and coal delivery business, was respected by locals, and had built a large home for his family. But George had strong political opinions, especially about the rise and fall of Benito Mussolini in Italy. He spoke openly against the dictator, calling him a murderer and a tyrant. In a small West Virginian town with a significant Italian immigrant community, that stance wasn't popular. Several prominent locals still admired Mussolini, viewing him as a symbol of Italian strength. That made George Sodder a target of resentment, and perhaps revenge. The insurance salesman's threat. The first sign of danger came months before the fire. A traveling insurance agent had come to George's home, trying to sell him a policy. George politely declined. But according to Ginny, the salesman's response sent chills down their spines. He reportedly shouted, "You're going to regret this. Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." The salesman was later identified as someone with connections to local mafia figures operating in nearby cities. That comment, dismissed as madness at the time, would later take on a terrifying meaning. Possible mafia motives. Investigators and independent researchers have proposed several mafia-related motives. Extortion gone wrong. George was a successful businessman. Some believe the mafia attempted to extort money from him, and the fire was retribution for his refusal to pay political punishment. His anti-Mussolini activism may have angered individuals loyal to the Italian fascist cause, even years after the war ended. Human trafficking or kidnapping. The most disturbing theory suggests the children were taken alive, either sold or hidden, as part of a coordinated abduction meant to terrify the family and silence George. No theory has ever been proven, but every strange detail of that night fits too neatly for coincidence. The strange car and the men watching. Several witnesses claimed they saw a mysterious car parked near the Sodder home days before the fire. Inside, two men sat watching the house, speaking in low tones. Another local said they saw a man at the scene after the fire began, stealing a block and tackle, a tool used to remove engines from the Sodder property. Was this the same man who tampered with George's trucks that night, ensuring they wouldn't start? The coincidence was chilling, and the pattern was familiar. Intimidation tactics often used by mafia enforcers in the 1940s. The fear that followed. After the fire, George began receiving anonymous phone calls. Sometimes, when he answered, the line would go silent. Other times, a man's voice would whisper in Italian before hanging up. One letter warned him to let it go, or the rest of your family might join them. Still, he refused to stop searching. His stubbornness made him a local legend, and perhaps a marked man, a threat that lasted a lifetime. Decades later, long after George's death, some of his surviving children said they still felt like they were being watched. One daughter, Sylvia, claimed that strangers occasionally followed her when she visited the old home site. Whether coincidence or continuation, the fear remained alive in the Sodder family, passed down like an inherited curse. Maybe the fire was an accident. Maybe it was revenge. But one thing is certain, someone wanted the Sodder family silenced. Whether through fear, corruption, or fire, the message was clear. Stop asking questions or burn with them. The fire was over. The ashes had cooled. But for George and Jenny Sodder, hope refused to die. Something inside them whispered, the children are alive. And then, witnesses began to appear. The first sightings, Charleston, West Virginia. Just weeks after the fire, a woman working at a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston reported something strange. She claimed she had served 5 children breakfast the morning after the fire. They were with 2 Italian-looking men and 2 women. The adults refused to let the children speak, and when the woman tried to make small talk, one man barked at her in a harsh tone. The waitress remembered the youngest girl looked exactly like Betty Sodder. Her report was dismissed by police as unreliable, yet she swore to it until her dying day. The motel witness, Charleston, same day. Another witness, a motel operator, came forward later that year. He said that a family, matching the description of the Sodder children and several adults, checked in late at night. The adults seemed nervous. They spoke Italian among themselves and kept the children inside the room, curtains drawn. When asked to sign a register, they refused, saying they had lost their identification. That was the last anyone saw of them. The woman on the bus, a possible escape. In early 1946, a woman claimed she saw 5 small children on a bus leaving Fayetteville, hours after the fire. The children looked tired and confused. One little boy was crying, saying he wanted to go home. The adults told the driver they'll be quiet soon. When this report reached the Sodders, George drove hundreds of miles following bus routes across the region, searching in vain. Sightings across the states. Over the next several years, tips flooded in from across America. A girl resembling Martha Sodder, spotted in a Catholic convent in St. Louis. 2 boys seen working at a horse ranch in Florida that a child believed to be Louis Sodder photographed at a carnival in Georgia. Every lead brought a flicker of hope, and another heartbreak when it led nowhere. Still, the pattern was too specific to ignore. The man in Texas. In the 1960s, George received a tip from a man in Texas who claimed that one of the missing boys, Louis, was alive and working under a false name. George traveled there in person, but when he arrived, the man had vanished. He never found the address again. The local sheriff said there was no record of anyone by that name. The most chilling letter of all. In 1967, Jenny received a letter from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s, dark hair, strong features, deep eyes. On the back, written in a trembling hand, Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. The handwriting was strange. The message, almost like a code. Jenny and George were convinced it was their son Louis. The resemblance was undeniable. They hired private investigators to trace the photo. But the man who took the case disappeared without a trace. The unanswered question, did the Sodder children truly survive the fire? Or were these sightings cruel coincidences, desperate hope projected onto strangers? To this day, none of the alleged witnesses were ever proven wrong or right. And that uncertainty, the idea that the children might have lived, turned the Sodder tragedy into one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. Hope is the hardest fire to extinguish. Even when the ashes grow cold, even when the years pass, the heart still looks for a flicker of what was lost. For George and Jenny Sodder, that flicker was 5 small faces, seen in crowds, in dreams, and in every stranger who looked familiar. The year was 1949, for years after the fire. The Sodder home had been rebuilt, but inside, the walls echoed with silence. Jenny still refused to believe her children had died in that fire. Every night, she left the porch light on, hoping they would return. And George, he decided he couldn't wait for the authorities any longer. A father turns detective. Frustrated by the lack of progress, George Sodder launched his own investigation. He hired private detectives, spoke with fire experts, and even contacted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, begging for federal involvement. Hoover replied personally, saying he sympathized but could not intervene unless invited by local authorities. The Fayetteville police refused. That was the first time George realized something larger might be at play. The excavation of 1949. Determined to uncover evidence, George persuaded investigators to excavate the site of the fire. A pathologist sifted through the ashes and found a few bone fragments. At first, George's heart leapt, but then came the shocking result. The bones belonged to a person aged 17 to 22, far older than any of the missing Sodder children. And worse, there were too few bones to represent even a single body. This confirmed what Jenny already believed. The children did not die in that fire. The billboard that haunted America. By the early 1950s, the Sodders decided to make their search public. On Route 16, just outside Fayetteville, they erected a massive billboard with photos of their 5 missing children. It read, "What was their fate? $5,000 reward for information about our children." The fire was not accidental. The haunting images of the smiling children became a national phenomenon. Travelers from all over the country saw it, wrote letters, and sent tips. The billboard stayed up for nearly 4 decades, a silent monument to the family's refusal to give up. The missing investigator. Among the private investigators the Sodders hired was a man named C.C. Tinsley, who discovered a disturbing detail. A member of the original coroner's jury, the group that declared the fire an accident, was a local insurance agent who had once threatened George Sodder after he criticized Mussolini, the Italian dictator. That man had reportedly told George, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed." When the fire happened, George remembered those words all too well. And not long after Tinsley's discovery, the investigator vanished, leaving no forwarding address. Another mystery inside the mystery. Years of searching. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, George and Jenny followed every lead they could find. They traveled across the United States and Canada, corresponded with psychics and self-proclaimed mediums, and even posted missing person flyers in Italian newspapers, hoping the children had been taken overseas. Each new lead was met with hope, and each dead end brought fresh heartbreak. But George never gave up. A father's final journey. In 1969, at the age of 73, George Sodder passed away, still believing his children were alive somewhere. Jenny continued the search alone, keeping the billboard up and the porch light burning every night until her death in 1989. When she passed, that light, symbolic of hope, had burned for over 40 years. The billboard comes down. After Jenny's death, the remaining Sodder children decided to take down the billboard. They replaced it with a small memorial plaque, a quiet reminder that some answers never come, and some wounds never heal. To this day, visitors who travel along old Route 16 still remember that towering sign with the faces of 5 lost children, a sign that asked a question no one has ever answered. For most, the fire was an ending. For the Sodder family, it was the beginning of a lifetime of searching. The billboard stood not just as a plea for truth, but as a monument to love, a message to 5 missing children that home was still waiting, light still burning, and heart still hoping. For nearly 80 years, the disappearance of the Sodder children has remained one of America's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. It's a story filled with strange coincidences, contradictions, and emotional endurance. One that blurs the line between tragedy and conspiracy. And though time has passed, the central question still lingers in the air of Fayetteville, West Virginia. What really happened on that Christmas Eve in 1945? 1. The official explanation, a tragic house fire. The simplest theory, supported by early investigators, is that the Sodder children died in the blaze, their remains destroyed by intense heat. But this explanation doesn't hold up to modern scrutiny. Experts agree that a typical house fire cannot completely incinerate human bones, especially when household items like appliances and furniture survive the flames. Fire temperatures rarely exceed 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit required to reduce bones to ash. And with no trace of remains, no odor, and no physical evidence, the accidental fire theory collapses under its own weight. 2. The kidnapping and conspiracy theory. Another theory, the one George and Jenny firmly believed, suggests the children were kidnapped. In the weeks before the fire, several strangers visited the Sodder home. One man offered to sell the family life insurance, warning that George's criticism of Mussolini would end badly. Another stranger was seen watching the children closely, pretending to look for work. Many believe these visits were scouting missions, part of a plan to abduct the children and silence George's political views. The cut phone lines, missing ladder, and tampered trucks support this idea. It's even rumored that the children were taken by force, driven away from the scene before the fire began. But if true, who orchestrated it? And why were the children never found, even decades later? 3. The Mafia connection. In the 1940s, organized crime had a presence across parts of West Virginia. George's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, made him a target among pro-Mussolini Italians, including some suspected of mafia ties. According to this theory, the fire was a message, a warning for George to stay silent. The children may have been taken away, possibly raised under new identities, their memories of the night buried with time. While no hard evidence links the mafia directly, several details, like the threatening insurance agent and the town silence, keep this theory alive. 4. The witness sightings, children seen alive. Multiple eyewitness accounts claim to have seen 5 children matching the Sodder's description in the days and weeks after the fire. A woman in Charleston, about 50 miles away, saw a carload of children the morning after the fire. A motel manager in South Carolina claimed a woman checked in with several quiet, Italian-looking children. Years later, a photo was mailed anonymously to the Sodders, showing a young man resembling Louis Sodder, with a cryptic message on the back. Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. Though handwriting experts examined the photo, its origin was never discovered. Was it a cruel hoax or a glimpse of the truth? 5. The psychological theory, denial and grief. Some investigators believe that George and Jenny's refusal to accept their children's deaths was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to cope with overwhelming grief. After all, the human mind can rewrite memories when pain becomes unbearable. In this interpretation, the theories, sightings, and conspiracies may have grown from hope turned into obsession. But even skeptics admit the evidence of tampering, the missing bones, and the strange letters are too consistent to dismiss as mere delusion. 6. The legacy of hope and obsession. For decades, the Sodder story spread across America, from newspapers to documentaries, podcasts, and now, the internet age. It became a symbol of unsolved loss, a tale that reflects the universal human need to find closure. Their surviving children grew old still wondering, what if? They never found the truth, but they inherited their parents' determination to keep the mystery alive. Today, visitors still travel to Fayetteville, walking the quiet roads where the Sodder home once stood. There's no memorial plaque now, only an open field and whispers of what happened that cold Christmas night. A mystery that refuses to fade. The fire ended the lives of 5 children, or perhaps only began a story that was never meant to end. The Sodder family searched for decades, driven by love, haunted by silence. Their light burned for 40 years, a beacon for the lost, a symbol of hope that refused to die. Maybe someday, someone will uncover the truth. Or maybe this mystery was never meant to be solved. But one thing remains certain. The world will never forget the 5 Sodder children, the ones who vanished into smoke and into legend. 8 decades have passed since the fire. The Sodder home is gone. The billboard has rotted away. Yet the question still flickers like that porch light Jenny Sodder kept burning for 40 long years. Were her children really taken that night? Did someone silence them to punish their father? Or have we simply refused to see the truth hiding in the smoke? What makes this case unforgettable isn't just the mystery. It's the love of two parents who never stopped searching, and the courage of a family who refused to let the world forget. If you believe these children deserve justice, give this video a thumbs up, share it so more people can learn their story, and make sure you're subscribed, because we drop powerful true crime documentaries like this every single week. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened. Your voice could keep this mystery alive, maybe even help solve it one day. Until next time, keep your lights burning, your hearts open, and your questions loud. This is #DarkTruth25, reminding you, some fires die down, but the truth never does.